Hello student, I am Professor Smita Jha from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I am here to discuss crime and the urban situation during Victorian era. Let us know about this situation. The study of Victorian crime and punishment is a rich area of research that has attracted the interest not only of literary scholars but also of social historians, legal historians, and criminologists. Related scholarship, therefore, often situates itself at the intersection of a number of traditional disciplinary boundaries, facilitating interdisciplinary conversation. Crime and punishment was a pressing issue for the Victorians and provoked a wealth of responses from contemporaneous commentators in literature, culture, science, and politics. As a new phase of industrialization brought immense wealth for some and abject poverty for others, Victorian urban centers in particular were afflicted by crime. This spurred efforts to establish systems of social regulation, such as the new Metropolitan Police in 1829, a plainclothes detective department in 1842, concerted efforts to set up urban police forces across the 1840s, and after 1856, a compulsory nationwide system of uniformed law enforcement. However, without an effective system of social welfare in place, social inequality and deprivation drove women, men, and children into petty crime and more serious offenses. These were often resulting in severe punishment, ranging from incarceration via penal transportation to hanging. Public execution, not abolished until 1868, attracted huge crowds of spectators, including authors such as Charles Dickens and William Thackeray, who wrote about these experiences. Popular street literature also conveyed, illustrated these events for a broad, diverse audience. Class and crime intersected significantly in Victorian England, where lower class status was often associated with criminality. The emergence of the respectable criminal during this era posed a paradox for society, challenging established crime discourses. Victorian literature reflected concern about crime, with a persistent focus on the problem, especially in urban settings like London. Female criminality in Victorian novels highlighted gender deviance within the context of class dynamics, showcasing the threat posed by cunning and violent female criminals to patriarchy and male homosocial bonds. The concept of a criminal class emerged, portraying a group of offenders as morally degenerate and constituting a danger to social and moral order. Execution broadsides of famous cases, printing the alleged last lamentations of convicts on the scaffold in verse, are estimated to have sold by the million. Elsewhere, new periodicals and magazines, particularly from the mid Victorian era onward, began to publish regular features that summarized the most recent criminal occurrences, not just from their local area, but from up and down the country. As the legal system itself was undergoing reform, comprising changes in legal evidence procedure, divorce law, women's property rights, and punishment for sexual offenses, for example, sensational trials caused furor and stimulated commentary in literature and the media. The Newgate School of Fiction was accused of glamorizing crime, and the popular penny dreadfuls were feared as vehicles to corrupt public morals. Sensational fiction in the 1860s, which often drew on real life criminal cases and newspaper reports, depicted the supposedly respectable middle class family home as a center of transgression. Detective fiction emerged fully and drastically diversified in this era, in some incarnations, choosing to focus on crime in the world of middle classes, while others drew upon the power of the uniform police to penetrate and explore socially inaccessible spaces such as urban slums. Victorian Britain was dominated by the Industrial Revolution. Whilst that brought huge growth in global trade, there was also untold squalor, poverty, daily filth, stench, and sickness for many. The sprawling metropolis that was London was a tale of two cities in the 19th century. The fabulously wealthy upper class West End and the gritty and grisly East End of London, whilst the West End girls took strolls through Mayfair and attended high society balls. Working class life in the East End was a lot less cheery. It was a time of grinding poverty, crime, and disease. Death was ever present. Women were subjected to regular domestic beatings, were driven into prostitution, or, if they are exceptionally lucky, overworked as domestic servants in middle class household. Men and women experienced life in workhouses and the sewers. It was a far cry from aristocratic life of West. The Victorian age was characterized by rapid change and developments in nearly every sphere, from advances in medical, scientific, and technological knowledge to changes in population growth and location. Over time, this rapid transformation deeply affected the country's mood. An age that began with a confidence and optimism eventually gave way to uncertainty and doubt and grievous conditions for the common man. Probably our most common reference points for this era are the infamous characters and their stories. Think the horrific true crime story of Jack the Ripper. Then there is the fictional, yet almost certainly based on real life experiences, Dickensian character in Oliver Twist. Charles Dickens was exceptionally good at bringing this era into vivid real life. Other writers of the time, like Henry Mayhew, often wrote like intrepid explorers observing an exotic foreign species when they described the slums and rookeries of the poor at that time. But Dickens had had his brush with poverty, prison life, and workhouses. And he used these insights in his descriptive 19th century novels. Read Oliver Twist, and you will enter an underworld of juvenile crime, pickpockets, robbers, prostitute, and ultimately murderers. You have got to pick a pocket or two was the daily reality for many poverty stricken petty criminals of that time. There were also famous criminals as well as famous detectives who caught them at the time. Jack Ripper is a perennial favorite. The grisly story of the Whitechapel murders continues to fascinate and repulse people centuries later. Jack terrorized the streets and alleyways of Whitechapel and Spitalfields over the autumn of 1888. His victims included Marianne, Polly, Nicholas Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, but there may well have been more. His murders spanned the beats of two London police forces, City of London Police and Scotland Yard. The conflict between these arms of the law and their leading personalities made it far easier for the Ripper to slip through the cracks. Violent crime counted for only 10% of all crime in Victorian London. But many violent crimes, including murders, were not recorded, particularly those of working class victims. It's amazing how many working class bodies could be swept under the carpet in Victorian Britain. Undoubtedly, there was a vast amount of violent crime that went on behind closed doors. And that is where crimes of domestic violence stayed in Victorian Britain. It was usual for domestic crimes and infanticide to remain unreported. Petty crimes accounted for around 75% of the total. And pickpocketing was right at the top of that list. A step up from pickpocketing was garroting, a kind of a street robbery or mugging where the victim would be partially strangled. There was huge fear around garroting, even though it was relatively rare, and the media fanned those flames. This furor led to Parliament passing the Garrotters Act in 1863, which reintroduced floggings as the punishment for violent robbery. Early in the 19th century, hanging was the capital punishment of choice for serious crimes. It was a popular event that drew thousands of spectators. By the middle of the century, hanging was only used on murderers, which reduced the numbers. Other serious criminals were sentenced to hard labor and or transportation to Australia. During this time, a new police force was formed. This evolved further in 1856 with the Police Act, which saw the start of the modern police service in England and Wales. By the mid 19th century, Australia was pushing back on the process of transportation. They did not want to be a dumping ground for British criminals. So, a revamp of the British prison system was needed. Older style, overcrowded, mixed goals were transformed into new model prisons. Prisoners could expect water, clothes, and separate facilities for men and women. An element of rehabilitation was introduced. This was progress. Whilst many of these aspects seem a far cry from modern Britain, there is one thing that remains the same. The media and public commentary can have a huge impact on perception. The media led the charge to punish violent robbers harshly, even though relatively low numbers of these crimes occurred. The resulting moral outcry led to parliamentary change. It's a shame the media did not raise the samest levels of attention to the domestic crimes that police tended to turn a blind eye to. At the time of Jack the Ripper, there was generally a strong support for the police force investigating the crimes. The press whipped up a nationwide panic over the East End crimes, aware that sensational murders sell papers. And along came W.T. Stead, the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, a champion of the working classes with a mistrust and dislike of the police force. Stead badmouthed them and his voice gained traction. However, many members of the public tried to help the police with their murder investigation. The Victorian 19th century was awash with crime, murder, and violence, not least the feminine art of poisoning. This was a clean method of murder that might conveniently rid oneself of an unhappy marriage or a love rival. Whilst poisoning cases framed interesting and salacious fiction, the conception of poisoning as a woman's crime relates to deeper stereotypes in Victorian society. The history of poisoning has been little considered due to the lack of archival material on poisoning cases. In the 19th century Britain, poisoning was a sensationalized crime, often in the public eye. No case better highlights the embedded Victorian middle class fear of the secret female poisoner than that of Christiana Edmonds in 1872. Edmonds poisoned boxes of chocolates and other sweets as part of a plot to target her love interest's wife. Her case demonstrates how poisoning was represented in the press as a female crime. During her trial, it was noted that crowds of well-dressed women came to sit in the gallery of the Old Bailey. They were described as enthralled by the defendant, with audience numbers increasing at every session. It was feared that these women were flocking to hear and learn how Edmonds conducted her crime. Later, meeting in groups to share the recipes and the tactics she used. Interestingly, this perspective existed. After all, the evidence is clear that poisoning, while popular with women, was not a uniquely female crime. Furthermore, women also committed murder through means considered more masculine. Eliza Gibbons murdered her husband in 1857 by shooting him in the head, and Jane Colbert was imprisoned for murdering her husband by throwing a knife at him and piercing his lungs in retaliation to domestic abuse in 1854. However, poisoning was closely linked with female murderers in the Victorian press, which was particularly related to sensationalist journalism. Cases involving a sexual aspect, such as adultery or the murder of a lover or rival, were seen as didactic warning of the dangers associated with out of control female expressions of sexuality to individual victims, but also to a stable society. It was considered that such women's divergence from the feminine ideal was a factor in their crimes. They also acted as examples of just why a woman's place was at home, under the control and supervision of a husband, father, or brother for their own and society's benefit. Furthermore, an essential aspect of middle class discourse was their superiority over the working classes, whose women were more likely to have to work outside of the home, again diverging from expected female norms of behavior. Court proceedings, press coverage, and public interest in women's crime thus reflected and reinforced norms of gender and class. Such cases also reveal the contradictory nature of such discourses as the press and public reveled in the fantasies of exoticized sexual revelation. Elijah Fanning was sentenced to death for poisoning in 1815, although none of her victims died as a result of her actions. Fanning attempted to murder her employers by poisoning their food with arsenic after she was disciplined by the lady of the house for revisiting the rooms of young male workers in the house while semi-dressed. Fanning provided 4 statements of good character at her trial, and there was doubt of her guilt, yet she nevertheless received the death penalty and was later executed in Newgate prison. It was hoped that harsh punishment would act as a deterrent. Amongst fears that cases of poisoning were on the rise, John Marshall, a member of Royal College of Surgeons, published a pamphlet in 1850 describing 5 cases of recovery from arsenic poisoning. In this pamphlet, he detailed why he thought Fanning was guilty. He claimed to have witnessed Fanning doubled over in pain after eating some of the dumpling she had cooked in what he believed to be an attempt to divert suspicion away from herself. He followed this with a piece in the Times describing her as one of the dictators of this dreadfully alarming and daily increasing evil. Marshall's accounts reflected popular concerns about the increasing number of poisoning cases and the role of women such as Fanning in the surge of cases. Legal professionals again tried to intervene 5 years after the Arsenic Regulation Act was introduced. In 1856, Betsy McMullen was tried for poisoning and murdering her husband. The presiding judge argued that women should be banned from buying any potentially lethal drugs and that those selling them should be convicted of manslaughter in the event of them being used to cause harm. Banning women from purchasing poisons would, in reality, have been practically difficult, as common poisons such as arsenic and chloroform had many domestic uses as cleaning aids or medicines. Oddly, the focus of legislations and detection in this era focused specifically on arsenic. although widely used. Many of the trials related to other poison. This special focus on arsenic was perhaps due to its particularly vicious effects and bitter, unpleasant taste. Contemporaries also remarked upon this focus on arsenic to the exclusion of other poisons. A letter written to Northern Star and Leeds General Advertisers on 23rd March 1850, signed only by an Englishman, for example, questioned why arsenic was subjected to stricter controls compared to other poisons available, many of which were subtler in nature. The writer argued that because these poisons were used in medicine rather than domestically, the other poisons were protected from legislation. This letter was dated a year before the Arsenic Regulation Act was passed in 1851, and it is probable that the author, like the judge in Betsy Macmillan's trial, would not have been impressed at the limited extent of this legislation. Portrayed as a subversive crime requiring no physical strength, female poisoners thus fed societal views of women as naturally passive but potentially dangerous and insidious when influenced by their emotions, particularly of a sexual nature. Such ideas supported and reflected a discourse of a stable society requiring women to be under the supervision of men. The idea that poisoning was a secretive crime is seen in trial judgments and contemporary press reports. In the Bartlett case, for example, the judge commented that poisoning were not like crimes of sudden passion. They were necessarily mysterious and hidden in their operation. But this representation was not just about the subversive nature of poisoning. The 19th century, as many periods in history, considered men physically stronger and more violent than women. Judith Kelman and Martin Weiner have discussed how male crime was therefore expected to be more violent and on the spur of the moment in comparison to female crime, which was less physical due to women's physical weakness. Press representation promulgated this distinction. For example, in both the Maybrick and Cleveland illustration, the victims were shown to be physically incapacitated either by illness or simply because they were asleep whilst the poison was administered. The female poisoner thus committed her crime in a non-violent manner. Cases of female poisoners offer a fascinating and instructive window through which we can review the intersection of class and gender norms in 19th century British society. Also, the growing influence of the popular press on public opinion and legislative change. The very fact that female murderers existed challenged the ideal of femininity that justified supposed national and middle class cultural, political, and moral superiority. The middle class domestic angel was at the heart Britain's concept of itself as a stable and constitutional nation at home, authorized to bring such civilizational benefits to the benighted and backward peoples of their empire far away. To explain the contradiction, poisoning was configured by the criminal justice system, the public and the press as an essentially female crime. Women were liable to be overcome by sexually related emotions, become potentially dangerous to those around them, and threaten the basis of a stable society. Such unsupervised women could commit heinous crimes, but ones of insidious and sneaky passivity in line with their natural characteristic. Such ideas also required a very specific definition of what constituted violence as an act requiring physical strength in the open rather than an equally harmful act committed with malice, a forethought committed supposedly in the dark of night against an unresisting victim. Through such understandings of poisoning, the public press and courts tried to maintain norms of gender and class. recognizing that women, middle class or otherwise, were as capable of violence as men, or that men were liable to resort to passive crimes such as poisoning, would challenge the entire class and gendered edifice around which society is structured. What are also revealed are the cracks in such discourses. The recognition of male violence and abuse towards women and the obvious contradictions between Victorian class and gender ideals and reality are exposed in the protest and sympathy expressed towards many women by the public, press, criminal justice system that judged those women by the same standard they critiqued and objected to through such sympathy. Even women's apparent threat to poison abusive men reveals the operation of women and their agency in resistance. An agency Victorian society did its utmost to deny. But through this study of female poisoning, we see signs that the center would eventually not hold and begin to fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. The press also made much of big financial scandals and frauds. A significant percentage of company flotations were fraudulent during the 19th century. Although the behavior of the corrupt businessmen provoked outrage, and when caught and convicted, a hefty prison sentence, he was usually described as an exception to the rule, a black sheep, or a rotten apple in contemporary parlance. He was not conceived as a member of those who, particularly in the 1860s, the Victorians labelled as the criminal class. Similarly, across the 19th century, broad shifts can be identified in the ways that criminals were perceived. At the beginning of Victorian's reign, key commentators like Edwin Chadwick tended to equate the criminal offenders with individuals in the lower reaches of the working class. They were considered reluctant to do an honest day's work for an honest day's wage and who preferred idleness, drink, luxury, and an easy life. In their eyes, the problem was a moral one. There were also concern about the dangerous classes who were thought to lurk in the slums, waiting for the opportunity for disorder and plunder. By the middle of the century, the term criminal classes was more in vogue. It was used to suggest an incorrigible social group, a class stuck at the bottom of society. Intrepid explorers of the slums and the rookeries of the poor, like Henry Mayhew, often wrote of this class as if its member belonged to some distinctive, exotic tribe of Africa and the Americas. Towards the end of the century, developments in psychiatry and the popularity of social Darwinism had led, in turn, to the criminal being identified as an individual suffering from some form of the behavioral abnormality that had been either inherited or nurtured by dissolute and feckless parents. All such perceptions informed the way that criminals were treated by the criminal justice system. Thus, by the beginning of Victorian reign, the bloody code of the 18th century had all but disappeared. Capital punishment only remained for murderers and traitors. Transportation to Australia had reached its peak in the early 1830s. To all intents and purposes, it ended in the early 1850s, not least because of the increasing hostility of colonists in Australia who objected to their land being used as a dumping ground. Various experiments were also tried in the treatment of prisoners. During the 1830s and 40s, attempts were made to enforce regimes of silence or isolation. If the problem was a moral one, then leaving offenders alone with their thoughts and their Bibles, requiring them to work and providing them with occasional visits by the chaplain was perceived as the way to their reformation. By the end of the century, as the understanding of the criminal changed, the doctor and the psychiatrist had become at least as important as the chaplain. In addition, Victorian liberal ideas of improvement and philanthropy began to feed into penal policy. Thus, studying the history of crime and criminal injustice in the Victorian society tells us more about them, their perception of criminal offenders, linked closely with the social orders in respect of both class and gender. With this, I wrap up the whole discussion. Let us meet in next lecture. Thank you.